All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, January 12th of 2022. Wow, it's a bit of a mouthful there. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today, whether you're watching live or watching it or listening to the recording of this show. Appreciate you being here. We've got a handful of questions in the queue here for today. Question about contest selection and the limiting of players with a certain amount of wins in lower dollar contests. So bit of discussion in Slack already about that, but we'll cover that a little bit. Some follow-up about sim variance, and looks like in particular the research builds, the 0010 research builds. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Question about how to get, I guess, maybe the biggest bang for your buck and try to add a little bit of value if you're building with limited time. I see there's a question here in YouTube chat about live scoring. So especially as it relates to late swap. So definitely some interesting topics here to cover. Not too much in the queue though. So if you've got a question for me, you got something you've been waiting to ask, go ahead and pop it into the chat now, and we will get to these questions here in about the order that they come in. I'm going to go ahead and start with T-Pick. Question in Slack here. He said, you referenced the $1 million winners on FanDuel and DK cannot play lower stake tournaments. Does this include not being eligible in the $3 tournaments or just the under $3 tournaments only? And Ben actually kindly linked the exact pages and what like the official rules are here on DraftKings and FanDuel. So on here it is. So this is DraftKings, right? They can't under $3 can't enter at all, right? And this is, I think, players that have $1 million or more in lifetime winnings. And then it's under $5 if the prize pool is less than 25K guaranteed. So like a contest like the $3 play action on Sundays for football, right? There's going to be sharks in those contests. There's still a pretty good contest to play because they're so big, but there are going to be sharks in those contests. I think it's easiest just to, in general, think about it under $3, with the exception of, some of the smaller field. There are some good contests sometimes. You get like the $3 3 max might be under 25K guaranteed. And then that's another contest that players with $1 million or more in lifetime winnings can't enter. FanDuel's, I think, is a little bit different here. Let's go ahead and pull that one up. Let's see here. Where are theirs? Okay, same thing here. So I think FanDuel... FanDuel is either $1 million or more in lifetime entry fees or more than 50K in profit. So a little bit different here on FanDuel. I actually think people will probably meet this a little bit quicker on the FanDuel side. I'm curious where... Yeah, DraftKings doesn't seem to say as clearly where the line is drawn of who's... They just say highest volume. But FanDuel is pretty clear here. $1 million or more in lifetime entry fees or profits of more than 50K. Probably a little bit more restrictive, I imagine, than DraftKings is. But theirs is just under $3, everything under $3. So, and FanDuel does a lot of contests in this $2 range. They do a lot of those like 222s and I think typically the 222 is the contest I'm thinking of here is kind of intentionally right within that range. So, but good question. Again, these are generally going to play softer, like coming back to this, right? The reason why we focus on this, they're going to play softer because, as a general assumption, the players that have this amount of volume, historical volume in their DFS history are probably sharper players, right? Probably more profitable, probably sharper players overall, or just have a ton of disposable money to spend and be unprofitable while playing $1 million in lifetime entry fees, right? But I think most of these guys are pretty sharp. Most of these guys are generally sharper players. So contests under that $3 range, just in general, probably going to play a little bit softer. So not a guarantee necessarily, and it's going to still depend a little bit on the contest. And there's a lot of low stakes grinders out there too, that really are good players at the low stakes, but should make it a little softer overall. So good question. Cool. All right. Let's see here. So KG, question about the research builds. And I think this is overall, I was following up on some of this conversation that was going on in the NBA chat here. But the question says, hey team, we had a good thread regarding the 0-0-10 build and the significance of weeding out some bad plays using it. Can you go more into depth on what would be the best benefits of running the pool of 1500 and when to use it? Also, what can it determine to bring some optimal plays into your lineups as well as staying away from some bad plays? So we'll do what we'll do here. We'll just do like kind of a quick, maybe 10-minute or so, 15-minute or so run through of what these research builds are, what we are actually trying to accomplish by doing them. So let's talk about this here. So I wonder, do I want to do this for football? Let me go look at that. I think this is better for football. I'm going to go look and see what the projections look like for football. See if they're at least looking kind of usable. Let's see. Are we projecting all the QBs? Okay, kind of weird. We have Brandon Allen projections. Let's just do it with NBA. That's fine. We'll do NBA. Okay. So what we are doing when I run these research builds, right? First of all, this is kind of just something that I started doing. It's a way for me to research the slate. I think Max was the one that originally kind of put me onto this as an idea. By no means is this a part of like the core pipeline here, the something that you have to do, right? This is just a strategy, a way to study a slate to figure out maybe where ownership is efficient, where it isn't, where there might be some upside that people don't see upside or something like that, right? So first of all, preface it with that. But what we're doing here is we are running a build and the settings are 0-0-10, as we mentioned here. Correlation 0, ownership fade 0, sim variance 10. And what this is essentially doing here is we're going to do 1,500 of these. And when sim variance is at 10, every lineup we build is going to be based on a single game. Let's remove any stacking rules as well. Every lineup we build is going to be based on a single game simulation, right? Sim variance 10, single game simulation. And we're turning the impact of correlation and ownership fade off, right? We're not valuing those in the lineup. So what we get out of this is every lineup is essentially the optimal for a single game sim of every game on the slate, or a slate simulation, right? What is the optimal scoring lineup if we just pick one random game sim out of it? And we do this 1,500 times. So let's get this build started. And the purpose of doing this here is to essentially approximate what is the percent chance of a player showing up in the optimal lineup at the end of the night, right? That's our goal. Now, there's an assumption here that's already being made. 1,500 simulations is not the full range of outcomes of the way every game on the slate can play out. Whatsoever. It's not even really close. It doesn't even actually come close to the number of individual combinations of every sim we have at SaberSim, right? Not even close. But it is a way of approximating, and I think it approximates pretty well the percent chance of a player showing up in the winning lineup. The other assumption that we are making here is that the percent chance of a player showing up in the optimal, the slate actual scoring optimal, is equivalent to the percent chance of a player showing up in the winning lineup, right? That's an assumption as well. So there's two kind of assumptions here, but ultimately the tool here, what we get out of this is we essentially have a way to kind of determine, is a player over or under owned, right? Someone like Okongwu right now in 1,500 slate simulations has roughly a 40% chance to show up in the optimal lineup. If he is owned at 50%, right? If this ownership projection is accurate, he is, and his percent chance of showing up in the optimal lineup is about the same as his chance of showing up in the winning lineup. He is theoretically potentially over-owned by 10%, right? Now, one thing to keep in mind there is he is still overwhelmingly the most likely player to show up in the winning lineup. If you fade him completely, you are taking a player that in 40% of the time shows up in that winning lineup and just removing him from your pool. But you theoretically, in the long term, stand to gain from making that decision because he is going to be owned. You are going to get essentially rewarded less than you deserve for rostering him, right? So you can kind of use this build in conjunction with the leverage column to determine roughly who are the players that the field is too far over on, is over owning, right? And who are the players that the field is maybe overlooking, right? They're not actually thinking about how likely a player is to be in the winning lineup. And you have to do this, I think, with some context, right? You can't just, I don't think, tunnel vision on these and look at these in a bubble. You might say, yes, Garrison Matthews, is being under-owned by 5%, right? That maybe makes him a good play, but he still only has a 6% chance to show up in the optimal. He only shows up in the optimal in 6% of sims, and we're projecting him at 1% owned, where there's a lot of uncertainty, right? If he comes in at 2 or 3% owned, that actually makes a pretty significant difference in how much edge you are getting on rostering a player like that, right? Similar deal to a guy like Tyler Hero. Maybe a better example just because he's a little bit more likely of a player that you would use in your lineups, right? Maybe the field is 5% inefficiently owning Tyler Hero, but what if he comes in and owned 3.5%, right? Suddenly almost your entire edge of rostering that player has disappeared. So what I typically use these builds for most of the time is to get a sense of where the field is going to be inefficient with their ownership and maybe make a couple different stands on a player, right? A lot of times I'll do this. I'll preface this by also saying I do this less for NBA because one, you typically don't need this much variance to build a winning lineup in NBA, right? The assumption that the percent chance of a player being in the optimal is being equivalent to the percent chance of a player being in the winning lineup, I think is a little bit worse for NBA. And two, because you're going to be late swapping so much throughout the night, it's hard to maintain all of these exposures that you've done and dialed in at the start of the slate, or even to know that you still want those specifications when big news breaks throughout the slate, which it always does. But I do this a lot for NFL and baseball. And what I typically will end up doing is I'll come up with a list of, it can be anywhere from 2 to 6 different players that I kind of think of the slate really revolves around, right? And I'm looking at players in this particular case. A lot of times a flag to me is if there's at least 10% of inefficient ownership on a player, one way or the other. And in this particular example, at this point of the day for this NBA slate, there's kind of 3 guys that jump out to me, being Lonnie Walker, Dinwiddie, and Okongwu. That maybe the field is a little bit, these guys are clearly good values, right? But maybe the field is overvaluing them a bit, right? They might be overrating what you are actually getting out of these players here. And maybe I want to be under on them, right? So maybe I'm going half the field on these 3 guys, or maybe I'm taking a more significant stand. So let me review the question here and make sure that I'm kind of making sure that I'm touching on each point here. So what are the benefits of doing this? I think the benefits of doing this is that you are using a simulation-based approach to sim the slate, essentially, and you can figure out where ownership is inefficient, right? I think that's kind of the approach. One of the big challenges of DFS is essentially calculating this number. What is the chance of a player showing up in the winning lineup for a contest I'm playing? That's a pretty big, consistent challenge that you'll see across the industry. Right, a lot of our competitors even essentially attempt to give you this number in some form or another. If you've ever seen a smash percent or a boom percent or anything like that, that's essentially what they are trying to compute. And this is, I think, a good way of doing it on SaberSim and doing it dynamically. Right, that's essentially what this number is. So I think the benefit is you have at least a pretty strong way of estimating the percent chance of a player showing up in the winning lineup. And I wouldn't so much think about it here as necessarily optimal plays versus bad plays, right? Because what you're always typically going to find is that the players that are the players that have negative leverage when you run your research build are actually generally going to be well projected plays that also have a pretty high chance of being in the winning lineup. Because they wouldn't get these high ownership projections if they weren't good plays at a baseline, right? If the worst projected play on the slate was 40% owned, DFS would be insanely easy, right? You wouldn't even have to do this. What you are actually kind of finding is like which of the best projected plays on the slate are being over-owned and which ones are being inefficiently owned, right? And on the flip side, you're not going to find crazy spectacular leverage on very well projected plays, because if they were obvious well projected plays, everybody would be on them, right? In this particular case, we're like looking at, maybe the 5.0 point per dollar value Trae Young, right? Or the 5.24 point per dollar projected value Tyrese Halliburton, who don't really necessarily compare to some of these 7x, 6x values, but give a lot of upside relative to their ownership. So this isn't so much about finding like optimal plays that you would be using in a cash lineup or bad plays, right? Okongwu's not a bad play. Whiteside's not let's look at some of these other guys, right? Dinwiddie's not a bad play. These are some of the best plays on the slate, but you might find a little bit of an edge being under on these guys if you think that their ownership is going to be inefficient for how often they make that winning lineup. So that's kind of the idea here. I think, again, I know I'm giving the example with NBA. It's just because these are kind of, it's NBA season, first of all, and these are the projections that are most up to date. I think in terms of when you should be using this, I prefer to use this in sports more where I'm not going to be late swapping as much, because this is purely, let's say it was lock right now, right? And I came to this and I came to the determination that I want it to be under on Walker, Dinwiddie, and Okongwu. If big news breaks after lock, it changes the whole context of the slate. It changes the ownership projections. It changes how often certain players are optimal, and it might change the way I wanted to approach these players. And because that's happening so often in NBA, I think it's difficult to keep up with that and keep running these 0-0-10 builds. I think this works best in sports where you're not going to have to late swap as much. I use this almost every single week in golf. I use it almost every single NFL showdown that I play, especially the big primetime ones. I use it consistently for baseball, and I generally use it for football, even though there is kind of a big late swap window in there, because those sports, I think, are generally a little bit more consistent throughout the slate. Even if there's news that breaks, it often isn't slate breaking. And if it is, I'm willing to kind of sacrifice some of the work I put in here. I also prefer it for sports where by default, with whatever contest you are playing, your default sliders are closer to 10. I think this would work better as a strategy if you were playing 150 max than it would if you were playing like a single entry or a couple or a smaller 3 max, right? Because one of the core assumptions here is that the percent chance of a player showing up in the optimal lineup is equal to their percent chance of showing up in the winning lineup of your contest, right? For smaller field contests where variance is just going to be lower, you don't need that. That assumption doesn't work as well, right? Okongwu's percent chance of being in the winning lineup in a 1,000 person single entry might be 85%. But in a large field GPP, it's probably closer to this number. So I would use it on sports where the slate is probably not going to get flipped on its head in a late swap situation, and where your sim variance is generally higher by default. Those are my two best. And what this ultimately lets you do is find a couple plays, a couple ways to take a stand, or find maybe some plays or get an edge where there's inefficient ownership. That's basically what this is for. So, but good question. Let's see. Joseph said he made a comment this morning. I guess it didn't get entered or deleted. Sorry about that. I don't know exactly what happened. I see sometimes I have these comments sitting in here before the stream starts, and other times I don't. I would say, they definitely won't get deleted in the Office Hours channel in Slack, so always feel free to pop them in there. But sounds like you had a good night. Took down the 5K 3 max last night. Congratulations. That's awesome. That is an awesome score. My best lineup last night, I had a really good lineup in the and one. And it had Juan, Toscano, Anderson. Every other player was hot. Had the flame emoji, right? And I got the 1 point from JTA. If he scores 24 points, I take that contest down, which is like not even. It's pretty good value for him, but he was 3K in starting and only played 7 minutes, so just ran bad there a little bit. But Brady versus Alex picks his NFL thoughts. I would say, I'll kick the ball back to you. What questions do you have about NFL? This isn't really a show where I so much like to tout or come on and talk about my favorite plays or least favorite plays, mostly because all of this information and the way that I come to those kinds of decisions, just like I walked through here, are all totally available to anybody with a SaberSim subscription. So I think it's a little bit more interesting to talk about, broader DFS strategy. Happy and if you have questions about that, happy to talk about that, or how to do certain things on SaberSim, rather than just come up with my favorite plays or fades, because I'm pretty transparent about the way I do that. And I think anybody, if you watch this stream often enough, you can kind of figure out exactly how I'm doing that for yourself and add to that. So, yeah, but let me know if you have questions about specific NFL strategy, anything, let me know. So Mitchell said, I upped Joker's projection a lot, but SaberSim didn't put him in my pool. I banked 3 max anyway, but why did SaberSim not put this highly projected player in my pool? There's a lot of reasons. I mean, I think he probably was in your pool. He was probably just not in your top 3 lineups. He was also 12K last night on a slate where there wasn't a ton of value, right? We got some nice value that opened up later with the Wizards and Dinwiddie opening up, but it wasn't like a slate where there was an enormous amount of value options, especially compared to some of the slates we've been having recently. Getting to a 12K Jokic is tough, right? So that's probably what was going on there. But what I suspect is that he probably was in your pool and you could have just made some adjustments there, right? Like, let's look similar example for tonight, right? Let's say that this is our build, right? And we're just looking at 20 lineups. And you might say, why am I leaning 5% LeBron James? He's not in my pool, right? Well, he is. It's just not in your top 20. And if you expect to see him or want to be 2x the field, he is probably there. So that's kind of why that's part of the reason the exposures are here, right? Make your adjustments, get the players that you want in there. Your pool of lineups here is almost always more diverse than it appears at first glance. So, but all right. Cool. John, I saw your question coming in Slack here. He said, single dad, and I obviously don't have time for hours of research before any slate. Any quick things I can do to help build better lineups, like unique settings and max exposures? This is a good question. So I think, first of all, like, this is kind of our shtick, right? Like, this is kind of our thing. The idea here, or part of what is like behind SaberSim, is that you are going to save. Our goal is to help you save a ton of time that you would typically normally have to spend setting rules, figuring out how you were going to deal with ownership, figuring out how much variance is appropriate for the particular contest you're playing, right? Setting all the player groups and things like that. You don't really have to do any of that here. In fact, I think there is, while I will never come on here and say that SaberSim is just a money printer that you can just come in here, press build, and enter lineups and just win over the long term, right? I think there's probably no better tool on the market that is positioned to build you better lineups to start with than SaberSim. And it's always important to remember, I think, how much is being automated for you here. And there are slates. Last night was a good example where I go in, and because of time constraints, things that came up, or just because I don't have like a big read on the slate, that I go in here, I build the lineups, and I just basically enter what comes out, right? That is often a thing. I would say this: if you want to add some value to your process, and don't have a lot of time to research the slate intensely, what I would do is I would leave the projections for the most part alone. I would leave the ownership for the most part alone, because it's not going to be a lot of time to kind of make valuable research-based decisions on where to move them. And I would run a test build, kind of see where things are. And I think it's fine to just play those lineups, first of all. I do. But if you want to kind of leave a little bit of a mark, I think there's a couple options. I think one is to maybe pick a couple of the players that it feels like the slate is kind of revolving around, right? Maybe they are players that are projected very well. Maybe they are players that are very highly owned, and to maybe take a couple stands on those guys, right? And this is really just if you want to kind of leave a mark here. But I had just talked about, John, I don't know if you saw the segment before this when I was talking about the research build. That is basically how I came to answering this question for myself. Is I thought, how can I make a decision on which players I want to be over or under on? And what I started doing is running these 0-0-10 builds, where I kind of look at the ownership versus the percent chance for a player to be in the winning lineup and make some decisions. And maybe on tonight's slate, maybe I come to the decision that the two guys that I kind of want to be under on are Walker and Dinwiddie, right? Those are two guys that didn't look so good in my research builds. Or maybe I just don't even want those guys to kill me, right? Maybe I'll just match the field, right? These are two guys that I think that the field is going to overvalue a little bit based on my research build process, and I'm good to go, right? I'm still using the SaberSim projections. So what's happening here is we're just sorting through 20 lineups and we're sorting through 500 lineups and pulling the best 20 that are following my exposures here, right? I'm not going in and changing projections. I'm not going in and changing the inputs. I didn't have a lot of time to research, but I'm leaving a little bit of a mark on the slate based on the one tool that I had time to use, which is my research build. And that tool might be different for you. That might be a different trusted content provider, to be honest. That might be a podcast. That might be something you read on Twitter, right? That might be a gut feeling, right? You might look at the projections overall and feel like LeBron playing in Sacramento, team with terrible defense, pace up kind of team, it is poised for a type of a ceiling night, right? And maybe you want to be 2x on the field on him, right? But what we're doing is you're going through lineups that have already kind of been built in a way that's viable for the contest and are well optimized, right? What I would avoid, I specifically don't want to answer this question by saying that there's a particular setting that you should be using, because I don't think that's the right approach. I think the best settings as possible are using the defaults that match the contest that you're playing. But I would say if you've only got a little bit of time, you're not going to be able to research the slate and go in super deep into every single team on the slate. The best thing I can advise is to make your adjustments on step 3, where you're working from a pool of lineups that already kind of fit the contest. And you'll see there's a lot more diversity in this pool than it maybe even looks. I just said that before, but than it looks, right? So you can get a lot of different lineup constructions here. But this is similar to kind of my approach. Like I don't spend hours researching every single game or team on the slate, because I think broadly speaking, I'm willing to kind of trust the models and the ownership and where things sit. But yeah. And I think the edge can be different on a different slate to slate basis or a sport to sport basis too, right? There are going to be certain, I've mentioned before, maybe you've got in your 15 minutes before the slate locks, it's a slate where there's questionable players playing in a late game, right? I don't know if Harden is legitimately questionable tonight, but maybe a good edge for this particular slate would be to pump up your exposure to the Nets and Bulls and Lakers and Kings in the event that we get Harden ruled out after lock, right? I think that's a good example of a different kind of an edge. I mean, right? So that's I think maybe. Oh, and Adam makes a good point here. If you do nothing but late swap, you're already adding an edge to a ton of people in your contest. Yeah, late swap's huge for NBA. I definitely recommend that as well. And John said, thanks for the answer here. I hopefully that was kind of helpful. I realized that wasn't just like a, do this every single time. But I think the reality is that a lot of the things that I might say on a traditional tool that are just do this and your lineups will just get better are already being done for you, right? The factoring in of ownership, the factoring in of correlation, looking at a player's real range of outcomes. So when you're down to 10 or 15 minutes before lock and you've got 10 or 15 minutes to make your build your own, I would, as best as you can, try to think about that from a strategy standpoint and maybe pick a couple spots to do something a little bit unique that's unique to you. And whatever the steps you are using to get to that is kind of, it's going to be different for every person. For me, a lot of times that's research builds. For you, it might be looking at, a different source or going with your gut a little bit or something like that. But I think that's the most valuable part of the process, because the easy stuff, the making sure your lineups are positively correlated and not negatively correlated, making sure your lineups don't have too much ownership, making sure that you have a reasonable size player pool for 20 lineups, right? All of that's been automated for you here. And I call that the easy stuff, because that's all the stuff that's the stuff that feels like a normal process on a traditional optimizer. That stuff's been automated. That stuff's been automated for you, so you can spend your time kind of doing the fun, more strategy kinds of things. And if you go through and apply that in step 3, you know that you're working with good lineups no matter what. Whatever any 20 you end up getting there at step 3 are viable, right? You're just making kind of your calls on where you think there's leverage or whatever. So. John says, it's funny because I don't know much about NBA, but I do well with it, but NFL kills me. Yeah, I think the thing with NFL too is that it's a higher variance sport. It's a higher variance sport where contests are very big, and I think exposures get spread out a lot more, and it can really feel like if you don't have a couple guys after an NFL slate that you are just crushed, because someone does, especially in those large field contests. Those large field contests are extremely high positive EV because there's so much dead money in them, but it does take a really long time to realize that expected value. And at the end of an NFL season, right, you've played 18 main slates. 18 main slates for NBA isn't even, it's like a little over half of the month, right? So it's smaller sample sizes, just a lot harder to realize that edge. So, but anyway, and I can't say this enough. I saw this again, but like, I probably should have said this first. If you are playing NBA, the most important thing you can be doing is late swapping by far. It outweighs the value of any other thing that you can be doing before lock on the slate. So if an NBA slate for you is putting in the lineups and late swapping when news breaks on your phone, that's NBA slates for me sometimes when I'm busy, right? Then do that because it's so valuable. So let's see. All right. Let's go ahead. I'm going to go back here to some of the other questions that came in at the start. Question from different John here. Is there live scoring or any way to incorporate live results into late swap? So to ask the system on the back end to take lower owned or higher variance guys in lineups that are further behind, etc. There isn't at the moment. You will see that as the slate is going on, we start pulling actual scores for players into your lineups and start showing them, but late swap doesn't use that or do anything with that. We are kind of talking about implementing something like this in a future update. It's kind of a big project, to be completely honest. This is a common question or request, but we've talked quite a bit about some kind of smart late swap kind of tool that can look at the actual scoring results, that understands where your lineups are currently scoring, the total ownership of certain players, where your lineups are actually, how owned certain players are, and what your total lineup ownership is in the actual contest they're played in. And then to do some more intelligent late swapping of basically doing exactly this, swapping lineups that are doing well into, chalkier, higher projected plays, and swapping guys that are doing poorly, or swapping lineups that are doing poorly and projecting them or putting them onto more lower owned plays and things like that. So that's something that's kind of on our radar. It is a little bit of a bigger project, and we are going to kind of have to figure out how to pull in live ownership, right, into the late swap tool, pull in actual scoring quickly enough to make sure that we can do this in a way that is efficient, but it's something that we want to do. So, but good question. Okay, cool. Let's see. What else do we have here? Adam says, NFL question. This is maybe one half tout and one half general. I don't know. But do fantasy points in playoffs tend to gravitate towards the best players? Like in a playoff showdown or 2-game slate, are punts less viable? I'm assuming teams keep their best players on the field much more, but maybe that's not actually right. I think that's maybe potentially true. I would be interested in, I'm answering this question like purely based on my gut feeling here. And not having a lot of data to back this up. I don't think punts become less viable, but I think the sport probably becomes a little bit more projectable, right? Football is a tough game. It's a demanding game, and it's not as if a running back that is used to getting 60% of the snaps is just going to immediately be able to start playing 100% of the snaps, right? I think there may be a little bit of an interest in getting the best players on the field, but given the nature of the sport, there's only so much that a player can play. In basketball, I do think we get this a little bit more, where teams will really tighten down into the 8-man, 7-man, sometimes rotations, especially as the playoffs go along. It's a lot easier to say, guy that normally plays 34 minutes is playing 40 minutes tonight, right? Than it is to say that a running back is now going to carry the ball 30 times a game. But I do think the sport gets a little bit more projectable, right? There are probably less surprises with who is going to be on the field. But as always, as with most of these things, I think what is probably more likely to happen, if this is a 1% edge, I think the thing is I think what we will probably see is the field will treat it as if it is a 5% edge. I think a lot of times these things come up. I answered a similar question about contract incentives for week 18. If figuring out exactly what all of the contract incentives look like, and all of the players playing for records and things like that. If you figure out exactly where all of that lies, and it amounts to you being able to project the week 5% better, what I suspect is that you are going to have a field that reacts to that far more and then makes it inefficient, right? So I guess all of this to say, my strategy probably would not change too much for a playoff slate than it would for a regular season slate for something like Showdown. That's just my personal take. I think, some of the guys that don't play as much, right, are still going to have to get their snaps, right? You cannot play football endlessly, right? Guys need to come off the field and get a break. And, at some point, someone's going to hit Stephon Diggs hard and he's going to need to take a play off, and Jake Kumaro is going to come in, right? This is just an example. I don't know what these actual wide receiver depth charts actually look like for the Bills, but that's the idea, right? And I think those punts are still valuable, right? Especially in Showdown. What does JJ Taylor need to accomplish on the football field to show up in the winning lineup for this game at 300 salary? It's not much, and he's probably going to be out there. So, but good question. And again, I am answering this question like totally based on my intuition here. I would be interested, and I think it's probably worth maybe doing a little bit of research here on snap share and target share for players in playoff games, because I could be wrong, and maybe this is a bigger value than I think it is. But that's kind of where my head's at. So, but good question. Let's see. Craig said that he upped Joker's projection as well, ended up with 40% and didn't do very well last night. Yeah, it wasn't really the night you wanted Joker anyway. But that was a weird game. That was a very strange game. It was like 41-28 at halftime, and then the Nuggets lost. It's just a weird basketball game. So, Craig said, can't quit him though. His ceiling is higher than almost everyone on every slate. I'll go right back to him next slate he's on. Yep. I think, and that's the right mentality, I think. It's interesting. He's a special talent, and it's starting to feel, there were a couple years when Anthony Davis was, on the Pelicans, where they weren't even the Pelicans at the time, right? Where it was so hard to fade him just because it was legitimately almost a 65 point projection every single time he was on the slate with 80 point upside, 90 point upside, right? And I play him every single night, and he was way more. At least Joker's not fragile, right? He generally is out there when he's supposed to be out there. But starting to feel like one of those situations again, where it's 12K and you still almost always play him. But anyway, Ron said, for NBA, I know it's tough, but what is your advice for adjusting to ownership comparing larger GPP versus single entry? For example, entering the quarter jukebox versus the elbow/daily dollar. NBA is going to be a sport where that ownership fade by default is going to be a fair bit lower anyway. If you're talking about those daily dollars, right? We're talking about by default, if you're using the default settings here, the ownership fade almost being off, right? This really is going to be valuing ownership very little. What this is basically saying is that for a contest of this size, it makes sense to build a lineup that has some correlation, right? That looks a little bit more at a broader range of outcomes for players than just their average projection, and builds the best lineup you can based on the strength of the projections. That's essentially what kind of our back testing tells us about the optimal strategy for these single entry contests. So I'm not very overly concerned with ownership for single entry, right? For something like the quarter jukebox, it starts to come up a little bit, right? We start thinking about ownership more from a little bit of a moderate standpoint. For adjusting to ownership for NBA, to be completely honest, most of the time my ownership process really just looks like letting the slider do what it wants with the lineups most of the time. I would say in general, I will take a look at the highest projected owned players on the slate overall and see if I kind of in general, why are these columns all weird? I will see in general if the ownership projections resonate with kind of the way that I think the slate is going to go, right? Or make sure that I think there's at least a reason why I'm seeing that the best projected or the most owned plays are truly the most owned plays, and maybe make a couple minor tweaks to maybe some of the more projected or some of the higher owned plays on the slate. But for the most part, for NBA, my process is generally to just let the ownership fade slider make the right call on where the ownership should be, right? So that's my take, personally. But let me know if that helps. I think maybe I'm missing something about the question too, but that's overall my approach. I mean, the other thing too, and like I feel like I beat a dead horse every time I come on here and talk about NBA, but I just think there's just less value in doing so much before lock because of just how overwhelmingly likely it is that stuff changes after lock, right? Like an example I always use, like let's just pull this up, right? Like this will likely become a little bit clearer as the day goes on, but this is absurd. Like look at this. This is how much is unknown about this particular slate. And even though, again, we will have more answers than we do right now when we're approaching lock, we're not going to have all the answers. And I just don't care too much about saying, oh, I got Joel Embiid at 12% owned when his optimal ownership was 15% owned. So I have 20% of him and I have the edge. When if James Harden and Kyrie Irving get ruled out after lock, I'm getting Durant, who should be 40% owned at 5% owned, right? Like if you are just late swapping, there's two sides of the whole late swap thing with NBA. The first is that it gives you a huge edge when you do it because so much of the field doesn't, and you get all of those nice inefficiently owned ownership plays when you late swap anyway. But second, it invalidates the usefulness of research before lock because you know things are going to change. So it like gets you on both sides. Like one, everything you are doing to research the slate on the whole before lock is likely to change. And two, you are likely to get bigger edges by just late swapping later. So again, for NBA in particular, I typically am not doing anything overly complicated regarding ownership above and beyond just using the right ownership fade for the particular sliders. So I know that's not the most satisfying answer, but that's the honest answer for me. So William says you talked about considering full fades on players who are minus 10 leverage in research builds and going 2 to 3x over the field for highly positive leverage players. When should we avoid doing this? I think I would be cautious of doing that here in the same situations I talked about before. So I basically where the assumptions that are backing up the research build are not as good. So where I would be cautious on overusing research builds is anytime you are playing a sport or a contest where your default is a lower sim variance slider, right? Like let's look at this real quick, right? So if we're looking at, let's look at the Saturday NFL slate, right? And we're building lineups for this slate. The default value for sim variance is going to be 10, which the builder is basically saying that you need to be playing with a level of variance or ranges of outcomes that is wide enough that you're essentially looking at single game sims to be successful in this contest. So approximating the percent chance of a player showing up in the winning lineup as the percent chance of the player showing up in the optimal for the slate is very good. It's a very good assumption. If we look at NBA tonight on a 9-game NBA slate, and maybe you're playing a single entry, right? You're playing the $5 single entry. How much variance do you need to be successful in that contest? Not very much. If you used an assumption that the percent chance of a player showing up in the slate optimal was equal to the percent chance of that player showing up in the winning lineup of this contest, it would not be very good. If you told me that you went in and faded Dinwiddie, Lonnie Walker, and Onyeka Okongwu because of your research build in a $5 single entry tonight, I would probably say that maybe wasn't the best approach. because this isn't a contest where where using a research build based on 10 sim variants is worth it, right? Another example of where I would avoid doing this is in a slate, in a sport where you potentially are going to have to be late swapping a lot, right? Because you are running a research build based on the inputs that you have at lock, and that data is less valuable 2 hours after that when the situation has changed. So if you told me that, let's use the same example, that Harden and Kyrie Irving get ruled out 2 hours after lock. And if you came back to the show tomorrow and said, well, Jordan, I didn't get to a lot of the Nets value and Durant that opened up because I had minimum exposure set for other guys playing in the Lakers and Kings game based on my research build, that would be another situation where I would say you probably should have put less value on that research build and opened your pool up more when you got new information during the late swap window, because your research build was based on information at 7 p.m. Eastern. And when you were late swapping at 10 p.m. Eastern, you should have updated, right? You should have adjusted your information based on what you knew then. So those are the two things I would look for, right? Where should I be cautious of my research build? Where am I cautious of my research build? It's sports where you don't need that much variance, and sports where the situation, the context of the slate is going to change dramatically throughout the slate. In a nutshell, NBA, right? You can kind of see where I'm like getting. In a nutshell, I don't do this that much for NBA, but for virtually anything else, I think it's pretty valuable. In higher variance sports, I think it's fine to take these kinds of stands pretty aggressively. And, in an NFL slate, that research build is probably still going to be valuable even after the afternoon late swap window. So, but that's what I would look at. And there's also I'm just kind of thinking about this. When should we avoid doing this question, right? So that's like on a sport. That's like on a sport or contest selection level, right? But there's also the other level of looking at this from an individual player standpoint. And that requires, I think, a little bit more nuance. That question's not as easy to just necessarily just perfectly answer, right? If we're looking at this here, our top 3 negative leverage play, or our top 2 negative leverage play, according to where the projections are right now, is Okongwu. Negative 11 points of leverage. But he is the highest % chance player to show up in the winning lineup, right? You are balancing those two things together. It is a player that is the top 2, theoretically, most over-owned player on the slate, and also simultaneously the most likely player to be in the winning lineup. So you need to kind of make a value-based proposition there of, how much ownership do you want to have to this player? How much exposure do you want to have to this player? Right? That's not a very easy situation where I can say for every player, this is the way to answer this. Right? Let's flip over to NFL real quick, because what I don't really like now, I don't really like that I'm talking about this from the standpoint of I wouldn't do this for NBA, and all of my examples are NBA. So let's do kind of a first look here at the Saturday to Monday slate for NFL. Actually, let's do just the Sunday slate, because I think the contests are bigger for the Sunday. And let's take a look at this, and we'll probably come to we'll see something similar here, is what I imagine. So let's build this here. This might take a second to build. NFL lineups are a little bit slower, but 0-0-10, same way. Let's build this and see what we get. I'm going to hit a couple quick questions here that I see in YouTube chat here real quick, and then we'll bounce back. But Craig said that he was looking for the SaberSim app on his phone. We don't have an app. So if you use SaberSim through RunPure, you should be able to just sign in on the RunPure mobile site on your mobile browser and then use SaberSim the same way. And it's mobile optimized, but there's no app to download. It's done in the browser. So Adam also said anecdotal, but I noticed my late swap edge has been better on Yahoo than other sites. I'm thinking people's focus is DK, FanDuel, Yahoo, so late swap gives you even more bang for your buck as you go down in attention. Yeah, I think it's probably, I can see that. I could definitely see that. I think there's also there's probably more people that just don't even know Yahoo. I think just given the nature of what Yahoo is, I think there's a lot of sharps, but I think there's a lot of other people that are just that don't even really realize what DFS is. I don't know if that makes sense, but Yahoo is DraftKings is a sports book and daily fantasy sports provider. Anybody that's on DraftKings kind of knows why they're there. Yahoo's huge, and they promote their DFS product and to people that have a Yahoo email address. And I get the sense that I think the floor at Yahoo is far lower than the floor at DraftKings of what is the worst DFS player? This feels mean to say, but what is the worst DFS player doing on Yahoo compared to what is the worst DFS player doing on DraftKings? I think that floor is just way lower on Yahoo. People that don't literally do not know what a projection is, do not know that late swap is a thing, have probably never really looked at a payout structure, basically just hey, this looks kind of fun and I like fantasy football, right? I really believe that. But anyway, research build's done. Let's jump back into this. So, okay. So let's look at our QBs for the Sunday slate. This is an interesting example. So here's an interesting example. So this is different, right? So in this case, and I know we're a few days from Sunday, things will kind of dial in and change. In this case, there's an actually really interesting example of a good positive leverage situation, right? We have the most likely to show up in the winning lineup quarterback is Mahomes. That happens 40% of the time, and the field is inefficient on him, right? This is inefficient on the underside. I would be jamming this. This is like a home run situation, right? This is slam dunk. Let me see if I can find one that isn't. Okay, so here's a good example, right? So then let's say that maybe you're going to find some lower ownership on a guy like Najee Harris, right? You're like, okay, Jordan, I'm looking at this and I see he's negative 12% owned, right? Or his leverage is negative 12%, right? That's true. Yes, maybe that's a good fade. But you need to be asking yourself, right? This is, if we look at the running backs, right? This is the most likely to show up in the winning lineup running back on the entire slate, right? And in fact, all three of the top running backs that are likely to show up in the winning lineup all have negative leverage. So if you are fading this player completely because you say he has negative 12 leverage, you are fading a player that shows up in the optimal 41% of the time. Are you okay with that? Do you want to be half owned on the player? Do you want to match the field? This is where this becomes a risk tolerance player that I can't answer for every single question, for every single user. I can't say this is my process. I think this is a good process when the assumptions are right for determining how likely a player is to show up in the winning lineup. But I can't really tell you 100% of the time how to use this information, because some of you are going to be like, dude, I don't care. Going to be owned 50% of the 55% of the time, and he only shows up optimal 41% of the time. Uncheck him. I'm done. I don't want him in my pool. That's great. There will be others. There will be others that say, I'm not taking that amount of risk. There's no way I'm fading the most likely to be optimal running back on a 3-game slate. Not a chance, right? That's why it's a personal question of kind of where your own individual risk tolerance is. If you run this research build and full fade Najee Harris and then come back on Monday and say, he had negative 12 leverage, you told me to fade him, what happened? I'm going to say he had a 41% chance to be in the optimal. And you got unlucky, right? So anyway, I'll wrap this question up. I'll say, be cautious of the process on the whole on sports where a research build run at lock is going to become obsolete because of late breaking news, and be cautious of the research builds in sports where you don't, or contest types where you don't need that much variance to be successful. Then second, there is not a hard and fast rule, I would say, that works for every single player on what to do with this information when you have it, right? This is the way that I think, this is a good way, I think, of determining what players are going over or under owned in general and how to identify those plays. But if you need to make the call of what does this number mean to you based on all the other information we have, right? What does this number mean to you based on this number, based on this number, right? Based on this number, right? All of these things, everybody's going to do something a little bit different here, right? And the builder, the last thing I'll note on this too, the builder kind of makes its own decision too. So now if we go in and let's say we actually run a build, right? So let's say we've done our research build and now this is the build that we're actually going to use for the lineups, right? The ownership fade slider is basically going to make this kind of decision as well, right? So we can actually run this and see. We might get 100% Najee Harris. We might get half the field. We might get even with the field, right? The builder kind of decides how it's going to approach this particular player, but it's not necessarily the only way to do it. So, like, for example, so we can look here, right? So, like, the two players we looked at in the research build were Mahomes, who looked like there was good positive leverage. And in the case of Mahomes, the builder says, yeah, let's go get 60% of him. In the case of Najee Harris, it says, let's get a little under the field on him, right? That's kind of how this broke out based on the ownership fade slider, right? You can say this. There are still 20 viable lineups in your pool of 500. Easy. You could say this. Wait, I'm sorry. You could say this, right? There's a lot of flexibility here. All of these lineups are equally viable. So, like, ultimately, your decision of how much to use this is your own risk tolerance. So, anyway, I'm going to move on because there are other questions in the queue. Let me know if that helps. There's not a very cut and dry answer that I can say you just always do this. So, Ron said, no, I appreciate that. Just going back to not overcomplicating things. Yeah, I think that's always a good approach, and it's easy to overcomplicate. And it's hard to remember how much SaberSim's automating for you with the ownership thing. So, but Adam said, yeah, Yahoo's tough because you can't download CSVs, but I've done a ton of copy and paste BS to figure out how many non-MME / non-sharp players are in these contests. I didn't know you couldn't download the full contest CSVs. That's interesting. But decent enough couples with the rake payouts and overlay. Yeah, for sure. Especially with the rake free stuff, overlaid contests, they're amazing. So Craig says, I'm assuming that rules you had prior to lock don't stay in your late swap builds. Last night I made no more than 3 players from the same team rule. At some point after late swapping a few times, I noticed that I had a lineup with 4 Memphis Grizzlies and nobody on the opposite team. Do I need to add rules every time I do late swap? You shouldn't. Those should be pretty persistent. It's hard. I definitely can't. I wouldn't be able to guarantee and say that they're like always going to be there, especially, things get complicated if you're uploading a fresh entry file, right? That can kind of reset things. But if we built this build, for example, let's build 20 rule, no more than 3 from the same team. Looks good. Let's build this, and we'll just enter this real quickly. And it should persist into the late swap, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Let's see what happens here. But it does get weird, right? If you're uploading a fresh entry file, I do think things can reset on you. So make 2 changes. Okay, we're good. Let's go to entries. Fill. All right, lineups are in. Okay, so now it's after lock, and now we late swap. So it's still here. So it should work. So, okay, this is the confusion point here. Don't you have to upload a fresh entry file every time you do late swap, or am I wrong on this? You don't have to. You do not have to do that. As long as you haven't made a change, like if you've changed your lineups manually on the sites, then you're going to need to get a fresh entry file. Or if somehow something has gotten out of sync, let me just show you. It'll be easier. I'll just show you exactly how this works. So this is your entry editor, right? So we got our lineups in at lock. We're sitting good at lock. We're sitting good. And now it's time to late swap. So we run this, right? We're doing our late swap. Our rule is persistent. Everything still looks good. We run this. So I can tell you I'll tell you kind of precisely how this works because I think it helps when you understand the logic. So this is the late swap build. When you download with this new entries file, first of all, this is an entries file. This isn't a lineups file. You don't need to go back to the entries file and fill this manually. You can just download this and just use this, right? But when we register on the app that you've clicked this button and downloaded this file, right? we take that as a sign that you have uploaded those entries. And when you go back to the entry editor now, your file will have changed, right? We will update it and say, okay, this user updated the lineups that they have in the site to the late swap build, right? Fill method late swap. You can see the build here is right there. So we can kind of track your entries file throughout the night as it changes. So makes it kind of easy to just keep track of things throughout the night, right? Now, there are situations where this can get out of whack. First of all, if you went in, maybe you ran this build, you downloaded it, but then decided not to upload it, the builder's going to think you did, right? It's still going to treat this, and you might get out of sync. Or maybe you went in and you just manually swapped a couple guys on the site, right? There can be situations where the entries file in the app gets out of sync with what is actually on the site, and in that case, you should upload a new entries file. But you don't have to. So Craig said, okay, I thought I had seen on a prior video that you had to update the entries file or you could get an error message. I probably, in whatever video you were watching, I probably explained it the wrong way. It's kind of flipped. If you are getting an error message, the easiest way to fix it is to upload a new entries file. But you don't need to upload a new entries file to avoid errors. So Alanda says, I've had the same stack issue happen to me sometimes during a regular build. Yeah, that's strange. I don't really know. Like, these are generally pretty persistent. In fact, what happens more often for me is that a lot of times I'll be playing around and demoing something live on office hours here, and then I'll forget that the rule is in and go and build my lineups later, and I'll be building with a rule that I don't typically normally use. You can also save. I think one thing that's just nice and easy, you can save settings here and then even rename them and say that this is my, these are my, this is my 20 max settings. Like, I always use these for 20 max. They always have this rule in there. And then once you have it saved, you can just load that later. So that would be a very easy way of like having to do that. But I know that's probably frustrating. So I apologize that that's happening. I'm not sure exactly why. I haven't seen that so much myself. But I trust that it is happening. I think the easiest thing to do would probably be to just have a backup saved version of your settings that you use so that you can load them here if you need to. But D Baker, you're not off topic, man. I'm happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about. You said, how does changing the min unique players affect smart diversity? It doesn't really. Those two things don't really. They are related in the way that like they both affect the overall variance and diversity of your lineups, of the individual players in your lineups. But one, I wouldn't say one necessarily affects the other. Sim variance is applied earlier in the process, right? So sim variance determines how big the simulation buckets are we use to build each lineup. So at 6, you have a certain sized bucket of sims that's being used for each lineup. That bucket of sims is bigger at 3. It's smaller at 9, right? And then min uniques basically is kind of determining, what lineups pass the test. Right. So we'll build all of these lineups and then we eliminate some because we'll say, oh, that lineup only has one unique player when compared to this lineup. So it doesn't get to go in. Right. I think sim variance is a better approach to diversifying your lineups because it looks at a range of outcomes for players, a wider range of outcomes, or it looks at the real range of outcomes of players, widens it, but it's still picking from real outcomes that are in that player's kind of distributions. Right. It diversifies your lineups by making them have more upside, essentially. The min uniques is more of just kind of a blunt tool to force more diversity into your actual set of lineups rather than relying on a wider range of outcomes of players. So they do kind of similar things, but I wouldn't say they relate to each other. One I don't think affects the other. There was a question yesterday, a similar question of somebody that said, if I change this to 2, should I lower this? And I would say the answer is always no. Because this is going to affect your lineup construction in a very direct way. And I wouldn't want to turn down my variance and affect the way that the lineups are constructed purely just to diversify. So. Larry said, I don't know if you've covered this already. What would your settings be for 2 20 max contests with 10 to 50K entrants and 2 single entries with 1 to 10 entrants, I would just use the defaults. So for the 20 max, I'd go 20 max, 10 to 50K. In the case we're building 2 of them, so I'd make this 40. To be clear, I probably wouldn't. I don't use the rules too much there for NBA. So I'd do this. Right? Just defaults. Single entry, less than 10, but we have 2 of them. I do that. That would be my approach. I am pretty trusting and pretty reliant on the default settings. So. Alanda says, I have some save. I noticed that the teams became unchecked. It's interesting. Let's see. Let's try this again. So here's our rule. So there's no teams in this case, but let's say we do have a team stack, right? So let's do this, but then save. So the teams can become definitely can become unchecked, like on different slates because they're going to refresh every time. But let's see. So let's just try a build now. Let's see what we get out of this. I think, honestly, I think we're doing a little bit of bug chasing here. It sounds like maybe there's a little bit of a bug, or the way that this information is stored is not correct. Let's see. Okay, so let's now go look and see. Maybe, I wonder, can we change to a different, I wonder if we can change to a different slate, and I wonder what happens there. So, I mean, I know that this maybe isn't exactly what you're saying, but the teams definitely can change if you change slate, right? And I don't know if this is stored across different sites. It might be. Yeah, so it does seem like it's... So you can run into some issues here. Looks like maybe across different sites and things like that. I'm mostly just kind of playing around. I don't have a perfect answer for what might have been going on here right on stream. I would say if you run into issues again in the future, one thing that you can do, we've recently added this, is go into settings and click report a problem. And if you can give us kind of as much information as you can about what's going on here, it'll send us some relevant information about your build and your session, and we can figure out maybe what's going on there in terms of your settings resetting, but not entirely sure. So first name Paris. Do I use cash or GPP settings when I'm playing FanDuel with multiple entries? It just depends on what the particular contest you are playing is. So if you're on FanDuel, right, a GPP guaranteed prize pool, right, it's a tournament. GPP is a contest where first place is winning the most amount of money in the contest, and then second is winning a little less, third is winning a little less, right? You have a staircase. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. What I was saying is that a GBP contest is where you are going to be incentivized to build lineups with upside, right? You are getting paid more for finishing at the top of the contest. A cash game, you are just incentivized for basically scoring in the top half, right? A double up or a 50-50, those are cash games, right? We recommend in general sticking to GPPs. Don't think there's a huge edge in cash games, at least at this particular point in the DFS lifetime, right? Anybody with access to a basic optimizer and a decent set of projections is going to build generally pretty competitive cash lineups that are going to be somewhat difficult to beat when looking at the rake, right? But this is a GPP, right? Not necessarily my favorite GPP, but it has that kind of stacking cash structure or stacking payout structure where you're incentivized to finish in the top half. So from there, you want to use the settings that match the contest you are playing. So if it's a GPP, use GPP. and then tell us what's the entry limit of the contest. How many people are in it? So if you're playing this contest, right, this is a 150 max, and there are 64,000 entries in it. So if you come in here and say this is a 150 max, and there are 64,000 entries in it, we're going to say this is the optimal settings to use to build lineups for this contest. Right? They're very different from, let's go find another contest. Here's a different one. This is a $50 single entry, right? This is a single entry. It's $50. There are 340 people in it. In this case, it's still a GPP, but it's a single entry. 100 to 1,000. Very, very different. Like extremely different way you would approach this contest. So that's the way I would do this. But cool. That is all the questions I see in the queue here for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We had a good stream here today. We talked a lot about these research builds. That was kind of a common thread here going through most of the day here today. Always like talking about that. Always think that's a lot of fun, but also talked about some contest selection stuff, late swap as always. What else? There's all kinds of stuff here going on. So I guess last note here from William here. Any updates on new future updates or features? I don't think so. I mean, throughout the entire week, I've been talking about like a few different things that are going on. I don't have dates for any of this stuff. A few things that are kind of floating around that we're talking about. We do want to continue to bring more support and more features to some of the sports that we aren't fully supporting right now or aren't supporting at all. So there is work going on behind the scenes on college sports, on models for other sports, NASCAR, updates to some of the more esports going on, a few things like that. That's kind of on the model side. On the product side, a few things that are floating around, always in the name of trying to give people more control in the way that their lineups actually end up looking. So tossing around ideas of something kind of resembling a player groups to give you a little bit more control over what combinations of players are showing up in the lineups. I mentioned the late swap update at the start of the stream. These are all things that are kind of going on behind the scenes a little bit here. I think those are kind of the big things that come to mind. So I don't have like a ETA for any of this stuff, but that's kind of what's going on behind the scenes. I guess there's one other question here from JL. He said, I don't know if you've answered this. Came in late. When new info comes out, like a player goes from queue to out, do I have to go back home and create a new lineup, or can I just refresh my current build? It is always better if you have time to start with a brand new fresh build. The reason why is because then we'll use the updated information we have based on that player getting marked out and rebuild a new pool of lineups with those updated projections. When you go back to a build you had before and refresh, all you're doing is resorting old lineups that are no longer the best lineups you can make to try to pull out the best lineups from that. So it works. If you're in a pinch and need to get lineups quickly, it's fine, but it's always far better if you have the time to do it to start with a fresh build. But I am going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you all for tuning in again to the stream today. We will be right back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, same time, same place. Good luck in your contests tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow. See ya.